Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Earth Day. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Grazing Cover Crops for Resilience, How Grazing Cover Crops Builds Resilience Through Soil Biology with Dr. Kris Nichols. I'm Kelsey Virgin, and I'm a Senior Program Associate with the Pasture Project at the Wallace Center, who is hosting this webinar today. To start us off, I'm first going to go over the logistics and how-tos for the webinar system. Then I will talk briefly about the Pasture Project and what we do. Then we will do some audience polling where some questions will appear on your screen. And after that, we'll get into our presentation, and then we will have about 15 minutes for questions at the end. So let's talk about logistics. In terms of the webinar technology, you should see the GoToWebinar control panel on the side of your screen. It should look something like this with the presentation on your left and the control panel on your right. You can minimize and maximize by clicking the orange arrow at the top. You'll want to use your control panel during the presentation, so it's best to keep it maximized. You can also click on the small triangles below to open and close different parts of the panel, such as the questions pane. You'll be in listen mode only during the presentation to minimize background noise, but please ask questions in the questions pane throughout the presentation. Questions will be addressed after the formal presentation during the Q&A time, but if you need clarification at any point or have technical difficulties, ask at any time. There will be a short follow-up survey that pops up just after the webinar is over. Please take a moment to complete this. It helps us as we develop our future webinars. I will note that folks calling in without access to a computer will have limited functionality. You will not be able to do polls or ask questions. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Pasture Project website in the coming week. So let's talk about Pasture Project. The Pasture Project is part of the Resilient Agriculture and Ecosystems Initiative of the Wallace Center at Winrock International. We work to advance and integrate regenerative grazing as a scalable, market-driven solution for building healthy soil, viable farms, and resilient communities in the upper Midwest, and specifically in the upper Mississippi River Basin, a 6-state region, although we do work with some national audiences. Some of the strategies we use to promote regenerative grazing are we develop a data-backed and field-tested case for regenerative grazing, which we do through on-farm research with a number of on-the-ground partners. Another is providing resources to producers for how to plan for and change to regenerative grazing practices. We also help build an alliance of supporters for regenerative grazing so that together we can reach more folks in more places. And we support shifts in political, financial, and other systems to support regenerative grazing as a widespread practice. Please visit our new website or contact us for information about Pasture Project's work. I will have listed our contact details at the end of this presentation. And just a quick plug for some more webinars we have coming up. You can go read those descriptions and sign up for those at our website, pastureproject.org/events, and stay tuned for more webinars later in the summer. All right, we're going to do some audience polling questions to help us get a feel for who's in the room. I'm going to launch the questions to your screen, and you should be able to click on the most relevant answer. First question, what is the primary role you currently have in agriculture? And you can select all that apply. So if there's more than one, you can click more than one. Crop producer, livestock producer, or grazer, university, agency, or nonprofit staff, private company, or other. And if it's other, you can list your question or list your occupation in the questions panel. I'll just wait a few seconds for everyone to answer. Okay. And here are the results. So it looks like 56% the majority is university, agency, or nonprofit staff, followed closely by livestock producers or grazers. So great. And then crop producers. So welcome, everyone. We have another polling question. How many years of experience do you have with cover crops if you are a producer? And select just one. None, 1 to 3 years, 4 to 6 years, 7 to 10 years, more than 10 years. Okay, and looks like tied 31%, both 1 to 3 years and 7 to 10 years. But it looks like we have a good range of experience here on the webinar today. And then we have one last polling question for y'all. Do you graze cover crops if you are a producer? Yes or no? Okay. All right. So it looks like we're really split down the middle here. 47% yes and 53% no. So great. We hope that information you learned today will help you with your management plans. Okay, thanks for participating in those polls. It really helps us get to know who is on the webinar today. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Kris Nichols. She is a leader in the movement to regenerate soils for healthy crops, food, people, and planet. She's the founder and principal scientist of Kris, which stands for Knowledge for Regeneration and Innovation in Soils, Systems Education and Consultation, and a subcontractor with Food, Water Wellness Foundation, My Land Company LLC, and Understanding Ag LLC. She is also working with the Institute for Energy and Environment Research on a project combining regenerative agriculture and renewable energy to reduce the economic risks in transitioning to regenerative agriculture. Kris participates on a regenerative agriculture advisory board with General Mills, a regenerative supply chain working group with Green America, and on the advisory board for the Real Organic Project. So thank you, Dr. Nichols, for presenting today. I will now hand it off to you.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here, and I want to thank the Wallace Center for inviting me to present this webinar to you today. What we are going to be focusing on, as was said, let's see, there we go. Now I go too fast. All right, so what we're going to be focusing on is the idea of grazing cover crops for resilience and utilizing the stimulation of soil biology, linking that system together on how we can actually magnify the effects of grazing cover crops in order to be able to build up that resilience. And one of the things that I wanted to start off with is kind of a discussion on what I think of when I think of regenerative agriculture. We don't really have a very good definition of regenerative agriculture yet. There's a lot of different definitions that are out there, but I look at it as a very innovative, integrated, and dynamic system. It's really a systems approach, and it's something in which you are integrating multiple enterprises, multiple tools and practices, and utilizing some innovative tools and practices and techniques. But the dynamic component of it means that it is something in which you are constantly evolving and creating and developing new iterations to be responsive to various types of issues that may be out there, whether that is marketing issues, climate issues, supply chain issues, not just for marketing, but supply chain issues for getting seed, getting chemicals, all of these different things that may be a part of having a dynamic sense for the system. So it's not really locking you into a specific rotation or a specific protocol, but actually looking at having that be an evolving protocol where you're looking at the whole system, the whole farm in a holistic manner, and not really focusing on the issues that you might have. We're going to talk a little bit about how I see the difference between the issues and the problem that exists in agriculture. And that's going to help to build up the resilience to the system, improving nutritive quality of both the animals and the crops that you're producing. And in this, we're basically utilizing the power of photosynthesis. This is all about how carbon is flowing. And this is especially key when we're talking about grazing systems and grazing cover crop systems, because what we want to do is we want to be able to build up organic matter that is in our soils And in order to be able to do that, we need to get a carbon influx into our soils that can come from photosynthesis, but we also want to make sure that the compounds that are formed by photosynthesis, the sugars, are transformed and flow through the biology in the soil and flow through a number of different things that are out there in the soil environment. So what we're going to do is we're really going to focus on starting off with thinking about the problem. And the problem that I see that exists in agriculture, I think that there really is only one problem, and it's that we do not have enough soil. We need to regenerate our soils. And when we think about soil, soil is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen bound to a mineral matrix of sand, silt, and clay. We have sand, silt, and clay, but what we need to do to have soil is to have that carbon influx. In order to be able to regenerate our soils and build up that carbon, we need to be able to have that influx of carbon that comes from photosynthesis and the flow of carbon through the biology, through the different organisms, transforming those carbon compounds into different carbon compounds, putting them into the bodies of the microorganisms. All of these things are going to help us in order to be able to build up soil. And when we're building up soil, what we're going to have is we are going to be able to resolve many of the issues that we see. So we're going to be able to build up resiliency that's going to help us to be able to manage water better. It's going to help us to be able to manage nutrients better. It's going to help us to be able to manage various types of pest and disease issues. And as you can see here from a photograph from David Brandt in Carroll, Ohio, the soil that is on the lower left is soil that came from David Brandt's farm that over more than 35 years he has regenerated so that it actually looks like soil. It has that carbon in it that gives it that dark rich color. It has the structure to it that is a little bit of a crumbly structure and has good porosity that's going to be there. The soil that's on the upper right is soil that is across the fence row from his farm. And what you can see there, that is what his David Brandt soil is classified according to the Web Soil Survey. That is what his soil should look like. But again, he's been able through management practices to transform and regenerate soil by putting that carbon back in, actually creating and regenerating the soil component to his farm. And so in order for us to be able to do that, we talk about various types of soil health principles and soil health. We need to have, instead of having a new green revolution, we need to have a brown revolution that's going to be focusing on utilizing these principles in a way in which we are going to utilize what I refer to as eco-functional intensification. We're going to be looking at our landscape and utilize it to the best intensity level that we possibly can, which means combining multiple enterprises, especially looking in an annual crop production system of not just including cover crops, but also grazing those cover crops, so that you are intensifying the use of that landscape. And we're not going to intensify the use of the landscape to the point at which we are going to be destroying that landscape. What it is to apply a certain amount of intensity to that landscape so that the system has to do continuous work. When we're doing continuous work, we're causing carbon energy to flow through the number of different organisms that you have in that landscape and in that system. And when we're looking at eco-functional design to this, it's looking at how we can best optimize various places within our landscape, not just for cropping systems, but also for cover cropping and grazing. So you may have areas in your fields that have a little bit more moisture or a little bit less moisture. So managing those areas separately, a little bit differently, as far as looking at different seeding rates, looking possibly at different cover crop mixtures, looking at when we put grazers out there, looking at how we may graze or manage some of those different locations a little bit differently to optimize their efficiencies. What we're trying to do is tap into optimizing the landscape use and maximizing the efficiencies. It's not a case of where with intensity we're trying to do a whole lot more, but we're trying to maximize the use and the efficiency so that we're actually doing less. And that's going to be where we're going to be layering multiple enterprises. But within this design, we also have to recognize that there is a cost to everything we do. Regenerative agriculture isn't magic. It isn't something that is going to instantaneously provide you with positive results, but it is something that is an integrated, innovative, dynamic system where it is looking at the flow of primarily carbon energy is what we're going to be following. And so it's the carbon costs that we're going to be looking at throughout the landscape. And what we want to do is optimize the use of the soil biological organisms, which can be in concentrations of millions of organisms in a handful of healthy soil. And so when you've got that in that level of concentration, that you have this huge density of organisms, you're redistributing the risk across that large concentration of organisms. So again, it's going to help us to be able to do, to reduce individual risks that you may have in this type of a landscape system. And at the same time, by utilizing all of these different organisms, it's also going to help us to improve some of the quality of what it is that we're growing, because we're going to utilize the organisms to tap into nutrients when the plants need them, so that they're most efficient at concentrating those nutrients in the grain or in the forage that's going to be fed to the animals when they're out there grazing. So it's looking at concentration and density rather than overall volume and amount. And so the principles that we talk about for economic and environmental wealth or for soil health are outlined here in this pyramid design. And I've put these principles, oftentimes with soil health principles, there's 4 primary principles that are talked about. Every once in a while, they add a 5th one. I actually have 6 principles here, and we're going to kind of go through these principles fairly quickly. But the idea is to be thinking about how they're going to be integrated into this system design. Now, I put them in a pyramid design visually, not just so that as you look at them, oftentimes when we look at a pyramid, we'll be looking at it and it gives us sort of a hierarchical structure where the things at the top are more important than at the bottom. But when you think about pyramids and the way that they're designed, this isn't a triangle, it's a pyramid. So there isn't hierarchy. Every stone that was part of creating a pyramid played a role in the architecture and the structure of that pyramid. And so every stone is a tool, and every layer where those stones are placed is a principle. So the tools that are allowing us to utilize the principles, all of that is integrated and plays a role in the whole structural stability of the pyramid. So when we're looking at how we're going to be addressing these principles, it is really looking at how we're going to integrate all of this together. And so the 4 primary principles that are oftentimes talked about are things like maximizing photosynthesis, or keeping it green and growing, adding diversity, so getting diverse crops, getting diversity from cover crops, from the crop rotation, getting diversity out in your pastures, in some cases putting in perennials with annuals, annuals with perennials. That can give us a lot of different types of diversity. The other 2 are at the top of the pyramid that are the 4 primary ones. One is reducing or eliminating tillage, so going to no-till or reduced-till types of systems, so that you're reducing soil disturbance and you're reducing the destruction of soil structure and the off-gassing of organic matter. So when we do tillage, we get a huge release of carbon from the soils. So we want to reduce tillage, and then you want to protect the surface of the soil with having residue or armor left on the surface. You want to protect that surface by utilizing, you can utilize mulches, you can utilize living growing plants, which is part of the cover crops. They can be a great protection. They're going to be growing and providing that living crop protection that's going to be on the surface of the soil. The other one that's sometimes added is managing livestock and integrating livestock in the system. Now you notice that a lot of these principles are integrated together. As I said, part of the pyramid design, they're all integrated and interlocked and interwoven. And the one that I've added that isn't discussed too much is reducing or eliminating synthetic inputs. And we're going to talk a little bit more about, in particular, the bottom three kind of together, because that is really looking at carbon flow and carbon influx initially into the system. And then we're going to talk a little bit about reducing synthetic inputs, because that becomes an important component from both the use of cover crops to help to provide fertility into the system, but also how that can help to enhance soil biology and biological activity in that system. Another way that I like to think about these principles is thinking about treating the soil like we're supposed to treat ourselves. So we're supposed to be grazers. We're supposed to eat small meals throughout the day. And what that means is, in eating small meals throughout the day, we're going to be feeding the soil throughout the year, throughout the growing season and after the growing season. So we're making sure that we're having that carbon influx, and that's where cover crops really come in. Is there a way to be able to extend that feeding of the soil of the carbon? Because the carbon, again, is the energy and the food source, and that's the meal that's going to be coming into that soil environment. Eating a diverse diet. Again, cover crops can be a great way to be able to add diversity to the system, which is going to be providing that diversity, not just in carbon and nitrogen ratios in the plant material itself, but also adding diversity from the standpoint of working with different types of organisms, both in the soil and on the soil surface. So you've got all of these different nexuses that are being formed on how everything is going to be integrated with having more carbon going in and eating this diverse diet. Now, the other thing with it is, and this kind of goes to some of the things that are going to be happening with grazing or cover crops and that intensification, is to exercise. If we're going to be healthy organisms, we're supposed to exercise, which doesn't mean that you exercise to injury or stress. It means that you look at the frequency, the intensity, the scale, and the timing of that exercise or those stress events. This is what we want to have in our systems as well. For them to be high-performing systems, for the plants to be high-performing and be more resilient, they need to have some stressors. They need to have a little bit of nutrient stress. They need to have a little bit of water stress. They need to have a little bit of competition. They may need to be grazed a little bit in order to be able to have stressors. Again, you don't want to have it happen to injury or to the point that it is going to reduce the growth of the target plant, your crop plant, but it is something that is going to actually make the plants have to work harder. And when you work harder, you're processing your body. If you're doing exercise, the whole idea is to process carbon differently so that it goes from the carbohydrates and sugars and proteins that you're eating, and now goes into building up muscle fiber and structural molecules as part of your body support. And that's what we want to have in the soil environment as well, something very similar happening. And then we also need to, if we're going to be healthy, we need to protect our body from injury, radiation, temperature extremes, etc. We need to protect the soil from solar radiation. We need to protect the soil from temperature fluctuations, and we need to protect the soil from water fluctuations. So all of this is going to be a really important component to how it is that we're going to be addressing the principles. So there's 4 things here and 6 principles, but they play off of each other if you think about how you may be looking at integrating this. And this really goes to helping you think too about some of the tools that you could put into place on being able to address those principles. So as I said, what we're going to do first is we're going to first focus on kind of the bottom 3. And we're going to think about this from, again, the carbonomics perspective. We're going to think about this from how carbon is going to flow through things. Every organism, ourselves included, has always and will always work for food. We've replaced in our societies, we've replaced food with colored green paper and coins, but the reality is we've always bartered for food. We've always worked for food because food is foundational to what we need to have as living organisms. So these first 3 are really looking at how we're going to get food, get the carbon into the soil environment. So you've got the maximizing of photosynthesis, keeping things green and growing. Photosynthesis is fixing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and transforming that into simple sugar compounds, utilizing the energy from the sun to do the biochemistry that's going to provide those sugars. And those sugars are now going to be utilized by the plants as well as the other organisms in order to be able to enhance the activities that are going to be occurring. So we're going to utilize those sugars as the carbon compounds that are going to flow through the system and provide the energy resources. This is similar for us too. If you want to have some quick energy, you're going to carb load. You're going to consume sugars or something that's really high in carbohydrates to provide some really quick energy. But then you're going to transform that quick energy into other molecules in your body, into muscle fiber. You're going to transform it into neurons that are going to help you to think. You're going to do all of these different types of transformations of those compounds. The biological organisms are doing this as well. When we're talking about livestock, there's some really interesting things that we're finding that go on with how we may be able to manage livestock to intensify and get carbon flowing below ground at a much higher rate. So we're going to be utilizing livestock, and I want to spend some time talking about livestock because that's really the focus of what this webinar is looking at animals in the operation. And when we're talking about livestock, we're going to talk some about grazers, cattle, sheep, goats, horses, other types of grazers, but it also is looking at managing other types of livestock, looking at managing birds and bats, small mammals, insects. All of those are part of the livestock that's going to impact the carbon movement and the nutrient cycling. So these are tools that you can put into place or you can enhance having in your environment. So if you're looking at birds and bats and insect populations, you know, insects, the majority of insects are not bad insects. The majority of insects are good insects. They're things that we want to have as part of the system. And so what we want to do with this is we're looking at basically potentially creating an environment, and cover crops can do this, where you can choose various types of cover crops that could attract things like predatory insects, that could attract pollinators, that also then are going to, because there's going to be increased insect populations, that are also going to help to attract bats and birds to the system. So looking at how we might be able to manage those organisms. And then when it comes to the grazers, looking at how we might be able to manage the large grazers that we have. All of these organisms, what they're doing is they're having an impact on the plant. And that's really what it is that we're trying to focus in on, is the impact that these organisms can have on the plant. Because that impact on the plant is going to change the way that carbon is going to be flowing through the system. So how much carbon, how much photosynthetic activity the plant is going to do, and how the plant is going to now allocate that photosynthate, allocate those sugars to the soil environment, and why the plant needs to do that. So what ends up happening when you do grazing, especially with something like cows, is cattle, when they're doing grazing, they don't really use their teeth. What you can see here is you can kind of see the cow at the bottom has its tongue sticking out. And what they'll do is they'll sort of wrap their tongues around the plants. And what they will end up doing is when they do that, they pull and tug at the plant because they're not slicing with their teeth. They're going to pull and tug at the plant. And what that's going to do is that pulling and tugging will oftentimes, sometimes they'll bring up a little bit of roots, sometimes they won't. But either way, that pulling and tugging is going to rip at the roots below ground, and that's going to shear off some root hairs. As you're pulling and tugging, if you think about it, and you're basically tugging a plant out of the soil, that the roots, even if they stay in that soil environment, the root hairs are going to get scraped on the soil itself, on the sand particles, on part of the soil matrix, on aggregates, all of those things. And that is going to cause some of the root hairs to shear off. And when the root hairs shear off, they are actually an elongation. Root hairs are an elongation of root cells themselves. And when those root hairs shear off, it basically opens those root cells. And so carbon compounds that are in those root cells are going to leak out into the atmosphere. They're going to leak out into the soil environment. So you're getting carbon to feed the biology in the soil that comes from what leaks out of the root cells that have now been opened, as well as carbon that comes from the root hairs themselves that got ripped off. So these become food sources for the biology to be more active. And this is beneficial to the plant that's being grazed, because what ends up happening here is now the biology in the soil is going to help to cycle. It's a signaling by increasing the food source to the biology. They now can grow and reproduce and create various types of enzymes that are going to help to release nutrients from the soil environment. So the plant can now have more access to nutrients in the soil and take those nutrients up and absorb them through the remaining roots and utilize them in their foliar tissue to make more photosynthetic cells, to make more chloroplasts, to make the enzymes that are needed to do photosynthesis. So the plant needs to have nutrients to be able to regrow and do more photosynthesis, and this grazing helps to create an environment in which that's going to occur. Now, not all animals, you can have animals like sheep or horses that are going to, when they graze, they use their teeth more. When we're doing haying, we do a similar type of thing that's really just a slicing action. And that's not going to do the tearing, and it's not going to do the tugging that happens when you're wrapping your tongue around the plant. So what ends up happening with those animals is they don't have as much of an effect on the root hairs, but they still can stimulate some carbon flowing below ground, because the plant response to wounding, this is a wound response now. So when the animal cuts through part of the leaf, that is a wound, and when the plant is wounded, it has to produce various types of biomolecules to cover that wound. Similar to us, if we get a wound, our body produces clotting factors so that the wound will stop bleeding, and you'll get scabbing that will happen so that you don't get pathogens that are going to come in through that wound into your body. The plant is doing the same thing. It's basically trying to wall off those cells that got wounded, and it has to produce factors, it has to produce biomolecules to do that. And then the plant will also now, again, have to do more photosynthesis so that it has the energy and the carbon compounds to not just regrow, but to also cover those wounds. And so what we're trying to look for in grazing management of cover crops as well as pasture crops, what we're trying to look for is how we're going to have a wounding pattern. And you can do some things with managed grazing where you can change the intensity of the stocking rates so that you can change the intensity of the grazing so that you could get wounding of multiple plants. So the animals will go out there and they may not eat a large quantity of one individual plant or maybe just a few plants, but they'll take bites of multiple plants. And so you're increasing the mass, the number of plants that are going to be wounded. And when they have this wounding, then that's when they're going to be putting carbon below ground. Now, I've got a video that kind of shows this a little bit more so you can see this imagery of how the cattle graze and pull up some roots, shearing off the root hairs, and how sheep go about grazing. And I'm going to provide a link to those videos. They're YouTube videos that I'll have a link for that you can look at later. But the idea is one of the things that I would encourage all of you to do is really to go out there and watch how animals graze and utilize that to help you make some decisions about how you want to manage the animals, especially in various areas of the landscape. So if you're trying to deal with weed issues, if you're trying to deal again with getting better growth in a certain area in your field, which is not usually as productive as other areas of your field, may have a lower organic matter concentration, anything like that, what you want to do is change your grazing intensity there to change the way that you're getting carbon flow and carbon dynamics that are going to be happening. That's going to provide for a lot of different benefits that we have to the system. So we're going to get carbon flowing into the system now, and carbon that's going to be utilized by the biological organisms. But I wanted to talk a little bit too about reducing or eliminating synthetic inputs. And you can do this by including cover crops in your system where the cover crops are going to be providing a certain amount of fertility. You can utilize legumes, which are going to enhance nitrogen fixation and put more nitrogen in the plant biomass. But you're also going to, just with anything that you're going to be growing, you're going to have nutrients that are going to be locked up in that plant biomass, that when that biomass is broken down by the biology, that's going to be releasing those nutrients for your subsequent crop plant. So it's a way of being able to tap into the fertility that's in the soil and locking that fertility up in the biomass of another plant. And when we put on too many inputs into the system, one of the things that we're doing is we can make the system a little bit more lazy. It's not going to be having to do as much exercise or as much work, because now we've provided for the fertility that normally we would want the plant to do a little bit of work to try and get that fertility from the biology that's in the soil and from that soil environment. So if we don't have the plant have to do that work to get that fertility from the soil environment, because we add all of that fertility to the system to be growing our cash crops, the issue becomes that the plant doesn't get as much. It's not just NPK that we're looking at, but it's also looking at other macro and micronutrients that the plants can get from the soil. And it needs those, especially micronutrients, to be able to make complex biomolecules that are important to resilience, to making things like antioxidants, to making enzymes, to making various types of proteins that actually can help to repel pests and diseases, especially insect, bacterial, and fungal pests that can help to build up the resilience of the plant. It can also help the plant to be able to be more resilient to water stress or temperature stress by helping to enhance the soil or enhance the plant structure through antioxidants that are part of the plant cell walls. And it also can help with the way that the plant is going to be managing water to be able to get nutrients from the soil environment. You're utilizing the biology to provide continuous fertility when the plant needs it. So it gets to the plant on demand, as opposed to when we add synthetic nutrients, we add what the plant needs for the whole entire growing season, but we only add that a few times. In some cases, only 1 or 2 times in the growing season. And I think of this in a similar way as to if you had a baby and you calculated out how much food the baby would need to get to be 18 years old, and you put all of that food in the crib with the baby, and you came back 18 years later and you expected the baby to have grown to an 18-year-old and be a functioning member of society. It's not going to work, because the baby doesn't know when it's small, even if it had the knowledge of how to go about eating and utilizing that food, there's no way that it can fit all of that food into its body to last for 18 years. And the same thing goes with our cash crops, is we feed the plant only a few times, 1 or 2 times, and that means that the plant doesn't have the resources that it needs later on in its growth, especially when it's going to be going into the reproductive phase. So it's important for us to be able to look at how we can manage the influx of nutrients into the system, and putting it in the organic form that comes from the cover crops, those nutrients being locked up in that biomass, can be far more efficient. When we look at nutrient use efficiency, that's what these graphs are showing. Typically, we have known since we started using synthetic nutrients in the early 1900s, we knew that nitrogen use efficiency for synthetic nitrogen fertilizer was somewhere around 30 to 50%, which means that 30 to 50% of the synthetic nitrogen that you add ends up in your crop plant. The rest of it is either lost or it's locked up in the system. Some of that may be available for subsequent crops, but for the most part, it ends up that you're not utilizing between 50 to 70% of the nitrogen that you're adding. For phosphorus, it's also the case that for phosphorus, it's about 30% of the use efficiency. And so these graphs really go to show that. This was a study that was conducted in 2002, and basically the top graph, the argument has always been, well, we've gotten an increase in yield, which is why we're increasing nutrient use. But as we get the increase in yield, the bottom curve is actually a nitrogen use efficiency curve. And so what that means is it is the yield, the number of megatons of cereal, which you could say bushels, per the pounds of fertilizer that's added. And that curve is going down, which means that it takes more nitrogen fertilizer today to make a bushel of grain than it took in 1960. And this is because in 1960, we had more soil, and we had more carbon, and we had more biological activity that actually helped to release those nutrients and provide for that fertility. Now, one of the great things that we can see when we're utilizing the biology is to utilize things like arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. These are organisms that actually grow inside the roots of the plants. And when they do that, they're able to provide the nutrients into the plant. And so what happens with mycorrhizal fungi is that you can get an interplant nitrogen for phosphorus for carbon transfer that can occur, where you can get nutrients flowing from one plant to another plant. You will have a legume plant and a non-legume plant, and the mycorrhizal fungus can connect them together. And so the nitrogen that's fixed in the legume plant by the rhizobium bacteria in the roots will go into the non-legume plant. And for the rhizobium to fix more nitrogen, the rhizobium needs to have an influx of phosphorus, because phosphorus is part of the cycle, the enzymatic cycle, and the electrons that are needed, the energy that's needed to fix nitrogen. And so the rhizobium needs more phosphorus, and having the mycorrhizal fungi, they are actually associated with phosphate solubilizing bacteria on their hyphae, which can help to provide that phosphorus to the rhizobium bacteria. So the rhizobium bacteria can fix more nitrogen, so that nitrogen can go into the legume plant, but it also can go into the non-legume plant. And then the phosphorus solubilizing bacteria that are on the fungal hyphae can also feed phosphorus to both the non-legume plant and the legume plant. So it's a far more efficient way of being able to get nutrients. And again, this happens on demand. So when you use cover crops, especially cover crops that mix grasses and legumes, you start to see this interplant nutrient transfer. And that's also going to help us to be able to manage water far more efficiently, because these nutrients are now flowing through the hyphal pipeline as opposed to having to flow through the soil via mass flow. It's a much more efficient way for the nutrients to be able to get into the plants. It also, because we're now putting it into the plants that are part of our cover crop, it's also going to make sure that the nutrients are going to be available to subsequent crops near where those subsequent crops are going to be growing. So that biomass, and not just the above ground biomass, but the below ground root biomass, is going to be near where the roots for the subsequent cash crops are going to be growing. So you're going to be able to enhance these efficiency rates. And we're also going to be able to enhance soil structure, which is going to help to provide protection, and it's important with reduction in tillage. So with soil structure, we're going to be able to improve infiltration rates. Soil structure is the creation of pore space or open space in the soil environment. And that pore space is going to allow for water to move very quickly into the soil and water to be held for a longer period of time. So this is an example from Gabe Brown's ranch near Bismarck, North Dakota. And this was in June of 2009. We had about 14 inches of rainfall in a 24-hour period. At one point in time, it was raining at about 8 inches per hour. The skies just opened up and it poured. And this is the picture of one of Gabe's fields the next day. You don't see any standing water. You see a little bit of residue movement, but very little residue movement. And the idea behind this is he was able, because he changed his infiltration rates from when he first started on the farm, from a ½ inch an hour to up to 8 inches an hour. And he did that by increasing the porosity and increasing the aggregation that happens in the soil. And you're going to get better aggregation when you have more soil biology, especially the mycorrhizal fungi. So as we stimulate, I'm going to end here, but as we stimulate carbon flow below ground by grazing and by having cover crops growing, we're getting more carbon flow below ground, and that's going to stimulate the activity of the biology, which is not just going to stimulate the cycling of nutrients by the breakdown of organic matter, but it also is going to stimulate the formation of soil aggregates. And this is what aggregates look like, these pellets that are in the soil. They come in different shapes and sizes, but the idea is that because they come in different shapes and sizes, they can't interlock together very tightly. So there's space between where they sit, and that's your pore space, and that's going to allow for the water to be able to get in, because that pore space isn't a large column, but it bends and curves around these aggregates. That bending and that curving helps to keep the water there for a longer period of time. All of this is going to help to support the resilience of our crops moving into the future. So as we look at combining the system together in a regenerative approach of getting more carbon below ground, getting more diversity, stimulating more biology, utilizing grazing to stimulate more carbon flow, utilizing the resources that come from the biology and protecting the soil, we're going to be able to have a much better functioning system. So with that, I would like to move on to questions.
Sure. Thanks, Kris, for that presentation. The great Earth Day presentation. I'm going to move us forward here. Move on to
Sorry,
that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you haven't already, please feel free to type questions in the questions box, and we will get to as many as we can with the time remaining. First question for you, Kris. Is there a frequency for grazing a cover crop that is too much or not enough from a soil biology response? And there's a second part to that question, but we'll start with that.
Yeah, so when you're looking at grazing, you want to do grazing where you are going to leave enough biomass, living biomass from the plant, that the plant will have essentially enough solar cells to be able to do photosynthesis. If you overgraze, you remove too much of the solar cells, so the plant can't do photosynthesis to be able to regrow. As far as frequency, the number of times that you go out there and graze, you do want to have, depending on kind of the intensity of the grazing, you do want to have rest periods so that you're allowing for that carbon flow to go into the soil, for the biology to process all of this. That all takes time. So when you're looking at a grazing system, if you're looking at integrating that with cover crops, you basically would be looking at doing essentially with cover crops sort of a one-pass grazing operation in a particular location. You can divide up your fields into smaller paddocks and move the animals through those smaller paddocks. And that can be beneficial, like I said, because you're getting more of the plants that are going to be touched by the animal. They're going to take bites of almost all of the plants. Whereas if you have larger paddocks, the cattle have a tendency, or the animal has a tendency, to go to the plants that it likes most. And because it's not fighting over a small number of plants, there's enough plants there for the animals, they're going to eat and sort of overgraze certain plants that taste good. So they're going to go for dessert first, and they're going to eat all of the dessert. And then, you know, they're not going to have much, they're going to leave a lot behind that's going to be the Brussels sprouts. And you don't necessarily want them to leave all of the Brussels sprouts or the broccoli behind. You want to make sure that they actually taste the broccoli and the Brussels sprouts and not just eat the dessert.
You touched on this a little bit earlier. Actually, let's see here. Soil compaction from livestock. I'm trying to,
yes. Yeah, when you're talking about soil compaction from livestock, it can be an issue. And this again goes back to the beauty of grazing cover crops, as well as if you are going to be out there doing some grazing where you may do some swath grazing or something like that, making swaths with your cover crops. You want to be careful about doing some of that, because what you want is you want to have biomass. And again, when you're grazing cover crops, you can have living biomass that is going to diffuse the energy of the hoof that's going to be hitting that surface of the soil. So before it hits the surface of the soil, that energy is actually going to be diffused into the plant, the growing plant itself. And so you don't get the same level of compaction that you would if you were to have more of bare soil, or if you were to be doing it where you're grazing something that is already dead and you're not leaving a lot of biomass on the surface of the soil. So the amount of biomass that you have on the surface, whether it's a living biomass or a dead biomass, can help to diffuse the energy. The living biomass can do a little bit better of a job of diffusing the energy because of the complex carbon compounds that are within living biomass. So that's where it comes into an advantage of grazing cover crops, to be able to have that out there so that you're reducing compaction. And even in high density grazing operations, you're not really getting the same level of compaction. So you'd think that you're going to have a large number of animals on a very small area, and that should lead to a lot of compaction. But again, we're looking at diffusing the energy, and you're also, within those operations, you're getting the animals that they're almost constantly moving, because they're constantly moving to another plant to take a bite. And so they're not standing for long periods of time in one area. We get a lot of compaction. We'll see a lot of compaction around areas where you have water, because the animals will stand there for a period of time. So what you want to do with these managed grazing is, again, you want to have the biomass to diffuse the energy, but you want to make sure that the animals are moving, so they're not standing in one area for a long time and putting that weight on the surface of the soil.
Great. I know that that is a big concern for a lot of grazers.
Yes.
Next question we have here: when reducing fertility inputs or other treatments in grazing a cover crop, how long does it take for the soil biology to rebound from residual impacts of synthetic inputs? Is there a lag, and can grazing help overcome this? That was a long question, so let me know if you want me to repeat.
So as far as the time period is concerned, we don't really know for sure exact time periods. It does seem to vary depending on the organisms. So depending on bacteria, their growth phases, they respond very quickly, but their response is sort of very quick, rapid growth, but then they use up all of their resources and they die. And fungi will grow a little bit more slowly. You have protozoa and nematodes that respond to the growth of bacteria and fungi, so their growth rates also vary. So there's not a particular period of time, but again, going back to grazing helping, what seems to accelerate it is that carbon flow. So if you have cover crops and you're grazing those cover crops and you're getting more carbon flowing below ground, again, if you want the organisms to respond and grow and produce the enzymes, if you want the biology to respond, you need to give it food. And so as long as you're designing a system that's going to be able to give it food and utilizing some of these tools to enhance the amount of food that you're giving it, you're going to get more rapid growth of not just bacteria, but fungi and protozoa and other organisms as well, because it happens more in response to food when they're responding and recovering from an event like adding synthetic fertilizers or some destruction that can happen with tillage. So if you respond with that by a food source, that can be advantageous.
Great. This next question, this person wants to know kind of the difference between complex cover crop mixes with warm and cool season species seeded at the same time for grazing versus complex warm and cool season species seeded at different times of the year. Would the impact be similar?
So what you're looking at with the species that you're choosing is obviously choosing species or species mixes and the ratios or the amount of various types of seeds to fit with how they're going to be growing most productively at that time. So if you are putting a cover crop mixture after something that is a longer season crop like corn or beans, you may want to include less of the warm seasons and more of the cool seasons, because that's the time of year that you're heading into. Obviously, if you're going to be doing it after some small grains or some short season legumes, then you can utilize both warm seasons and cool seasons. Now, when it comes to that impact on the animal, you also want to be looking at forage quality. And so when we're utilizing some of the warm seasons, and if you let them go too long, their forage quality can start to decline a little bit. So you're wanting to be able to look at how much time you're going to be having that cover crop growing, and when you would go out there and graze in order to have the highest level of forage quality for the animal, both from the cool season plants as well as the warm season plants in the mixture. When it comes to the biology, warm season crops are usually more highly associated with, warm season plants are highly associated with the mycorrhizal fungi, which doesn't mean that you have to just have warm season plants that are in there. The cool season ones are associated with mycorrhizal fungi, but not as much. Usually the colonization rates are not as high as what happens within the warm seasons. So if you are looking again at trying to add diversity and balance some things out, that also goes to looking at your cash crop and your cover crop combinations. So again, when you have got something like corn or beans, those are going to be warm seasons. They're going to both be fairly highly mycorrhizal. So it fits that you would be putting in some cool seasons because you want to have that diversity that's there. So you're really trying to look, one, at when you're going to be planting it, when the plants are going to be growing, and the forage quality. But you could also look a little bit at the biological aspects, like with the mycorrhizal fungi, although, again, those issues are going to kind of resolve themselves when you're targeting more on timing for plant growth and forage quality.
So it kind of depends.
So it kind of depends, yeah.
Yeah. So I know that we are 1 minute over time, but I was hoping there's a question that I think a lot of people will find very relevant. So Kris, do you mind giving a quick answer to this one?
Not at all.
At what stage of growth best to graze a cover crop in terms of nutrients for the animals as well as impacts on soil?
So you want to be grazing a cover crop at a stage where the cover crop, you want it to be, you don't want it to be going into the reproductive phase. You want it to be in the vegetative phase. So even before the reproductive phase starts. So that can be a good kind of time to target, because what's happening within the plant, as the plant starts to go into the reproductive phase, it is starting to allocate a lot of its resources above ground to go into the reproductive components. If you wait until it starts to get into the reproductive phase, the issue becomes that you may have too much above ground in the higher parts of the plant that's going to get grazed off, and too little resources that are going to be left to funnel carbon below ground. So you're wanting to do it while it's still in the vegetative growth phase, but it's kind of in the later vegetative growth phase when it's going to start to go into the reproductive phase, but you want to catch it before it goes into reproduction.
Great, thank you, Kris, that's helpful. Thank you everyone for submitting your questions. I know that we're 2 minutes over our allotted time, so thank you for hanging in there. And I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody's questions. Just another quick reminder that we do have some other webinars, so please feel free to visit our website and sign up for those. And also, if you'd please fill out our post-webinar survey, it really helps us inform which webinars folks want to see in the future. And if you have any questions, feel free to follow up with myself. And there's my email address as well as Dr. Nichols. So thank you again for attending today's webinar, and I hope you have a great rest of your Earth Day.
Thank you very much.